We are paid, that's all. We are God.
Hey, I'm back. Thank you for waiting, guys. I'm sorry it's been a while, but after a month, here is part 6 of What If Naruto Was the Red Flash. Naruto finds out about Uzumaki clan when he was 4 years old. Naruto swears to rebuild the home of his clan and finds all the family he has left. Don't forget to like and subscribe to this channel and check the author in the description. Let's start. Chapter 37, A Seal of Phoenix. Naruto. He stood silent at what Roku said. The young Uzumaki stood confused and a bit happy, but at the same time wondering where he was. Is this a dream? Naruto asked himself, his eyes looking around at the endless sea on the horizon. The sun was shining above the ocean, reflects the destroyed village below. His eyes turned to look at Roku again. His white robe had golden lines around his wrist, looking like a seal. His white hair reaching his waist. Naruto looked at his eyes and could see hardness and pain in them. It felt like looking at Hokage Gigi and Toad Gigi sometimes. Most of the time, they would smile and joke. Still, on rare occasions, their eyes would be like of a warrior, a man who had seen war with his eyes and knew the ugly side of humans, what war could do to a man, how far people could go to gain the smallest amount of advantage against the other human. To win a war, but there's no victor in war, only losses. Right now, Naruto felt like he was looking at the same kind of eyes, the eyes of war and suffering. Roku Uzumaki? Who are you? Naruto finally asked, still not knowing who the man was. The older man formed a smile on his face brightened up. Almost like he was talking with someone he knew. I was the first Uzumaki, the one who found the Uzumaki clan, he stated with a calm tone. Naruto's eyes widened at what he heard. He gained his attention quickly and bowed his head respectfully, his right hand across his chest, his hand opened in front of his heart, showing respect to the elderly in front of him. It's an honor to meet you, Roku-sama. My name is Uzumaki. Naruto introduced himself, still bowing his head until he noticed from the corner of his eyes, Roku moving his hand gesturing for him to look up. Naruto did that and looked up at Roku. No need for that, young Uzumaki, you're a member of my family, but I can feel the Senju blood in you, way too similar to my father, Roku said with a hint of melancholy and taking a step closer towards Naruto. If I can ask, where are we? And how are you here? Naruto asked with a respectful tone towards his great-grandfather. That will be revealed, but first, he snapped his fingers, and the view changed. Now Naruto stood in front of a cliff. At the horizon, he could see a fantastic village. Uzushiogakure was carved out of a colossal stone hill beside the sunset sea. The highest tower was in that position that when the sun was behind it, the shadow looked like the waves of a sea. Uzushiogakure of antiquity built a ring fort on the peak, and as millennia have passed, its natural defenses have been expanded with walls, gates, and watchtowers. The base of the rock contains large sea-carved caverns. The stone has been mined for thousands of years, so there are hundreds of mine shafts in the depths of the rock, as well as yet untouched gold veins. The island that Uzushiogakure was built was around 1100 kilometers in length and around 700 kilometers in width, making it the largest island in the known world. The Phoenix Gate, the main entry to Uzushiogakure, is an enormous natural cavern reaching 200 feet high. Its steps are now wide enough for 20 riders. Its port has docks, wharves, and shipyards and is accessible by longships and cogs. From below the Uzushiogakure, thunder can be heard, where the sea comes in. Naruto could see a large waterfall coming out from a side of the village dropping to the sea below, homes built close to the waterfall. All of the houses had the Uzumaki symbol carved in them. Trees everywhere and looked beautiful, birds singing around. Naruto saw the main house of Uzushiogakure was much larger. This one looked to have 9 floors, the walls red, the roof had 9 large pillars that came together in the center, forming the Uzumaki symbol. Amazing, Naruto said with a hint of awe and sadness in his tone. He wondered how it would have been if he had grown up here, away from the people of Hidden Leaf Village. Raising with other Uzumaki, having friends to play with from the beginning, and not bothering and not being afraid of glares and insults in front and behind him. I built Uzushiogakure as a place of peace. I taught my children and my grandchildren and so on to always enjoy peace. An Uzumaki should always believe in a better world, never give up hope, and most importantly to never give up on family, Roku said, and the scene changed showing within the village. Naruto could see at least 6 big markets around the village, people walking around. He saw a big fountain close to the main house of the village. The fountain looked like 3 children playing around, from their hands water dropping, some people drinking and washing their faces with it. Roku-sama, you say you taught your grandchildren. How old are you? Naruto asked respectfully, looking at the old Uzumaki. The older man chuckled and turned to look at Naruto. I died when I was 247 years old, he stated, and Naruto's eyes widened. He had read, and even Kurama had told him that the Uzumaki clan had a long lifespan, but this wasn't something he expected. Wow! I have read about it but never thought that someone could live that long, Naruto replied, still amazed by what Roku said. He chuckled, and his face grew more serious. You're asking yourself how you are here and why? Roku asked, and Naruto nodded his head. Is because of the final seal that I made for Uzushiogakure, he stated, and Naruto saw as thin lines around the ground of Uzushiogakure started glowing red like blood. The lines spread across the whole island. Naruto looked all around and saw a giant seal that covered everything, every house, tree, and even inside some of the places. This was the seal that I made in case something happened to my clan, he stated and made a hand sign. Naruto looked below to see the seal spreading, even more. Small lines started spreading from red strings with strange marks around the ground. This seal was made to ensure the survival of our clan even in the darkest times, he stated before turning to look at Naruto. Tell me, have you felt anything the closer you got to Uzushiogakure? Roku asked with a firm tone. Naruto nodded his head, remembering the feeling he had when he first arrived in Wave and the whole time since he got here, almost like someone was calling him. This seal can detect anyone with Uzumaki blood nearby, but the seal works as a shield as well, he stated, and suddenly the whole island was covered by a giant shield that covered the entire island. If this is true, how were Kyumo, Iwa, and Kiri able to attack Uzushiogakure? Why didn't the shield protect them? Naruto asked with a slightly higher tone, his hands making a fist and clenching his teeth. At that question, Roku lowered his head slightly. I don't know for sure, but I can speculate someone betrayed our clan. I don't know if someone who was an Uzumaki or someone outside the village who knew how to penetrate the shield, Roku stated with a hint of sadness in his tone. He turned his head around and looked down at the village. Despite that, my seal still protects the village. Only an Uzumaki can walk inside and learn the secrets that were left by our clan, he stated, and Naruto understood why no one could visit the island anymore. You mean the Phoenix contract? Naruto asked, but Roku shook his head, much to his surprise, and turned his head towards the young Uzumaki. My son Yatari Uzumaki was the one who found the secret of the Phoenix contract. He told me that he had sworn to secrecy never to tell anyone how he had found it, but the contract works differently from all the other contracts. He started walking closer to Naruto before pointing the finger at his stomach. Can I see your seal? He asked nicely. Naruto didn't know how could the older man knows that he had Kurama sealed inside him, but decided to ask later. He grabbed the end of his shirt and slowly removed it, and his seal was glowing red and had grown lines with strange marks that had gradually spread around, almost reaching his chest. Roku smiled slightly at the work of art, and he was glad that people still appreciated and knew the importance of Fuinjutsu. Amazing work, but tell me, what do you think your seal does? He asked, his voice strict, his fingers on his beard, and his eyes feeling like he was looking at his soul. Naruto knew the seal did more than just hold Kurama but wasn't sure what else it did. My seal holds Kurkyubi sealed inside me and protects me if I lose control, he replied, and Roku nodded in agreement and raised a finger. That's true, but that's not all that it does. The Phoenix contract can communicate with us through our seals. I made a rule after my son established how Phoenix contact worked. They can communicate with us through our seals. The rule was that every Uzumaki that was born and was already born to have the Phoenix seal, and if they found you worthy then they will help and guide you. Whoever made your seal made sure that Phoenix Realm would one day communicate with you and see if you're worthy, Roku stated. Roku noticed that Naruto almost used Kyubi's real name and was glad to know that Naruto has a friendship with the Ninetails fox. Naruto smiled happily, and sure that must have been his mother than the one who did this for him. He still couldn't comprehend the advanced seals used by Uzushiogakure. He knew his clan was superior when it came to Fuinjutsu, but this was just amazing. Roku-sama, if I might ask, what level is the seal that used to protect our homeland? Naruto asked curiously, still unsure how someone could create a seal as large as the island itself. The scene changed, showing what Naruto thought was a younger Roku alone in a large room. He was sitting on the ground, in front of him was a large blank paper that almost covered half of the room. Behind Roku were many open and closed seals, books, and brushes. It took me a long time. I studied Fuinjutsu my whole life, always eager for more knowledge, wanting to see just how far can Fuinjutsu go. It took me almost 200 years of my life of nothing but dedication to finally earn enough knowledge to create this seal. And it took 9 years to create this seal. The strongest seal. The seal of life, he stated and put his hand on Naruto's shoulder. The scene changed again, and they were standing in an open field, the village far on the horizon. He kneeled and took a leaf from the ground, and handed it to Naruto. You see, every village has a will to believe in. Konoha believes in the will of fire. Kyumo believes in the will of lightning. Iwa believes in the will of stone. Suna believes in the will of wind. Kiri believes in the will of water, and Wei stopped and put his open hand in front of his chest. We believe in the will of life. Naruto's face brightened, and he put his open hand on his heart. Roku smiled and sat on the ground spreading his legs across the field. How can you talk to me? I mean, you have been dead for a long time. Naruto asked, still not sure how the older man could talk to him. When I created the seal of life, I split half of my soul in the seal to make sure always to be there to guide the future generations. That resulted in my early death but still was worth it, he explained smiling. Silence took over. Naruto was enjoying the beautiful view in front of him. To be able to see how Uzumaki was before the Third War was a dream come true. He could see now why his mother had mentioned many times that Uzumaki was an amazing place to live. How is Kurama? Roku suddenly asked out of the blue. Naruto turned to him surprised. How did he know Kyubi's real name? How do you know his name? Naruto asked curiously, his hands behind his head. With the winds flying all around him, Naruto could feel the fresh scent of nature around him. Despite being in a dream, he still could feel it. My father told me the names of all bijou when I was a child, my brother and I knew them. A little. I met Kurama when I was a young man. Back when I was young, he still wasn't large. The first time meeting him, he was only a bit larger than a small house. He looked frightened by me, but we talked, and I was happy to meet him, he said, smiling. Then his smile slowly disappeared and turned into a frown. Last time I saw him was when I was 197 years old. Kurama had changed, and so had the world, Roku said with sadness and a hint of anger in his voice. The scene in front of them changed again, showing Roku inside a large cave. Naruto could only see the darkness but knew there was someone or something there. The younger Roku looked at the darkness in front of him with a stoic face. I know you're there, my friend, he said, his voice echoing around the cave. Suddenly a growl was heard, the sound of someone standing up echoed through the cave. An eye opened above Roku. The younger Roku could feel the ki coming from his old friend, and it wounded his heart to know that his friend had no trust in him anymore. Why are you here, Roku? Are you here to use my power? Has the time come for you to betray me as well? Kurama spoke slowly, showing his teeth. But Naruto could see the sadness in his friend's eyes. Despite not feeling anything in this dream, he knew his friend was keeping his real emotions in check. Roku took a step forward and shook his head. I'm sorry for what the people of the mountains land tried to do to you, but I would never give up on a friend and certainly never betray you, he said seriously and with a kind tone. Kurama's eyes widened at his words before releasing a small sigh of relief. Naruto turned to look at Roku beside him. Mountains land? He asked, not knowing who he was talking about. You know them as Kyumo, or the land of lightning. With the time, the names of certain places changed as well, he replied, and the scene changed again. It was during this time that the bijou understood that many people see them only as a tool for power. This leads to the bijou losing their faith in humanity, Roku spoke. Showing Roku fighting against people with weird tattoos on their forearms. The tattoo looked like a sun split in half by a spear. Therefore, my first grandson Akashi Uzumaki made the rule that Uzumaki clan was forbidden from trying to harm in any way, shape or form the bijou, Roku said. And the scene changed, showing Uzumaki again but this time in ruins. Naruto felt his heart sink by what he saw. He knew his homeland was destroyed but saw a great village like this one in ruins. What should I do? Our village has been destroyed, what do you think I should do? Naruto asked, sitting down and looking at Roku, who sighed, still looking at the village in front of him. I taught my people to believe in peace and prosperity. My father told me how my uncle had turned his back to the family. He had abandoned my father to get stronger. Killed his own friends to gain more power. Did it matter in the end? He asked, grabbing grass from the ground. The grass slowly started turning black and burning in crimson-red flames. No, what it did. It caused a war that didn't stop for centuries. How many people lost their loved ones, children, without parents, and for what? To have more power, to have the edge over the other one, he stated with melancholy, clenching his hands together in front of his chest. If you want my advice, find every Uzumaki left, rebuild Uzushiogakure, but never give yourself to revenge. Is like killing someone while you poison yourself, he stated. Naruto kept quiet and just kept looking at the village in front of them. Roku stood up, and he put his hand on Naruto's wrist. Go to Uzushiogakure, something is waiting for you there, he said, and Naruto felt a burning sensation on his wrist. He was about to ask what he did when he saw that Roku wasn't there anymore, and slowly everything turned to darkness. That night a seal formed in Naruto's wrist. The seal was red and looked like the spread wings of a bird. There was no bird, only the wings. Later, Naruto slowly opened his eyes and decided to leave and train outside with Kakashi-sensei earlier. After a long talk, Naruto and Kakashi left, but on the second floor, Inari looked at the redhead with a bit of admiration in his eyes. He remembered what Sir Shinobi-sama had told him that night. Kakashi sat beside Inari, both looking out at the ocean. Naruto didn't say any of that out of spite. He's just a bit stubborn, is all, Kakashi gently said. While what Naruto had said was the cold, bitter truth, the weight of those words was not something an 8-year-old could handle. Naruto was different. He had been handling such weight ever since he learned to walk on his feet. Naruto is just like you in the regard that he has no father. Kakashi knew that Naruto knew who his father was, but Naruto had no memories of him. In fact, Naruto has no memories of his parents at all. They were taken away from him at his birth, so he doesn't understand what his parents are. He also had no friends, he explained. Inari's head lifted to face Kakashi, confusion in his eyes. Kakashi continued, however, there wasn't a single moment when I saw him cry or get sulky. That was true. Naruto, until now, had faced the difficulties of life head-on and won, becoming stronger after defeating each challenge. He is desperate to make people recognize him, Kakashi said. Even now, when Naruto had a bored/indifferent expression almost all the time, Kakashi could see it in his eyes. The hope that someone would recognize him for who he is was naked for the world to see. Unfortunately for Naruto, the world acted ignorantly. Kakashi chuckled softly, he got bored of crying at the world a long time ago. Inari looked down, beginning to understand what Kakashi was trying to say. Naruto was not born strong, and he chose to get strong to live his life in a better way. Naruto knows where true strength comes from, just like your father. Naruto might be someone who understands you the most, Kakashi said. Inari slowly understood that Naruto might be the only one who was most similar to Inari. Kakashi's eyes smiled, the words that he said to you earlier, he's probably told himself that over and over again. A brave face slowly showed in Inari's face, his right hand fist in front of his face. I won't be a coward anymore, father. I will be brave just like you, Naruto. Tomorrow. The following day, Kakashi woke up earlier than usual. He knew today was the day Zabuza would most likely attack. He woke up Sasuke and Sakura but not Naruto, and he was still sleeping from training like crazy last night. He decided to let him sleep for once. He looked down at the sleeping form of Naruto. The sheet was slowly falling from bed to the ground. The Jonin smiled behind his mask and quietly grabbed the sheet and covered Naruto, making sure not to wake him up. When Kakashi, Sakura, Sasuke, and Tazuna finally arrived at the bridge, they were greeted by the sight of several unconscious builders. It appeared these builders had been slung to the sides by the flat of some huge sword. Zabuza had officially returned. Where's the Uzumaki brat? I want to fight him again. Zabuza asked. You will have to fight me, he's not here right now. That's disappointing, but maybe I will get to fight him once I slice all of you. A heavy mist quickly formed around the group, confirming Kakashi's suspicion. It would be annoying to fight on this bridge. He'd have to limit his techniques if he didn't want to destroy them. It was so hard to conjure a mud wall on asphalt. Around the team appeared a group of 4 Zabuzas. Sasuke judged them as water clones, and as he looked, their muscles tensed as they prepared to swing their swords. The swing was still ungodly fast to Sasuke, but he had finally reached the level where he could duck it and off to the right. Before, they were getting owned by just one of these. Now, they were able to fight back. It was definite progress. As his team ducked, Kakashi jumped in the air and threw several shuriken at each Zabuza clones. His throw accelerated the shuriken to invisible speeds through training, and Zabuza's water clones were too busy to dodge. Around Team 7, the clones burst into water. Through the fog, Kakashi heard Zabuza whistle. Impressive brats. Only a week of training, and they've already progressed this far. But it was still too soon to bring them in a battle like this. The demon's voice echoed through the fog. A single seal from Kakashi and much of the fog parted, revealing Zabuza and the shorter masked ninja standing behind him. It looks like Naruto was right. Kakashi started. Our mysterious masked friend is playing on Zabuza's team. The masked one flinched slightly at the mention of Naruto, something that both Zabuza and Kakashi noticed. The masked one's mine, Sasuke said. Kakashi held him back. Don't be foolish, you've improved immensely, but I can tell that masked ninja could face even me. Fighting him would mean your death. Kakashi argued, stepping up to Zabuza. I'll face both of them. You protect Tazuna from Zabuza's water clones. And with that, the mist thickened, and the two Jonin were obscured from view. And for the next minute, neither Sasuke nor Sakura had any idea what was happening in that fog. Oh, they heard sounds, stuff like the clashing of swords, the rushing of powerful water jutsu, and, oddly, ice forming. Occasionally, a terrifying killing intent would wash over them only to be subdued, a split second later, by a calming intent of equal strength. Just being near this battle was akin to torture. After an endless 60 seconds, a figure came out of the fog, spinning so fast that it looked like a tornado. Sasuke was able to track and intercept Haku's weapon before it could cut him. Sasuke used his kunai and clashed with Haku's needle. The Uchiha knew this was his moment to know just how far he had gone. Chapter 38, A New Sharingan. Naruto. Ah! Why didn't somebody wake me up? Naruto's voice echoes through the room like a screeching seabird. No way! They forgot to wake me up. He shoots up out of bed and goes crashing downstairs. He looks around, and he sees Tsunami preparing breakfast for them. Where are they? Naruto half shouted that his sensei had ditched him. Tsunami stopped cutting the fish when she turned her head to Naruto. Your sensei told me to let you sleep since you were tired, she explained kindly, smiling at the redhead. Naruto sighed in annoyance and just decided to leave before something could happen. He quickly wears his sandals and goes to the front of the door. See ya. Naruto waves to Tsunami. Naruto takes off on the trees, and he observes ahead for anything out of the ordinary. As he leaps through the trees, it becomes evident that Naruto's heavy training has paid off. He picks up the pace a little, his eyes flicking around as though searching for something. Then, his eyes focus on something down on the ground. Whoa, hey, what's that? He frowned, crouching down to examine the deep wounds. Naruto glances up, and there are similar marks on the surrounding trees. The same weapon made those marks. He murmured under his breath. His gaze hardens, the gears in his brain working now that the cobwebs are gone. They lead back towards the house. Could it be, did Gato send thugs to take out Tazuna's family? The house. Back at the house, from outside, Tsunami's voice could be heard. Inari, could you give me a hand here? Inari, be right there, mother. Inari's voice was heard. Behind the house, two men approached the dwelling. One was tall, one short. The tall one was shirtless, with bandages circling his abdominals and a hakama on his lower half. He had tattoos all over his torso, had scars on his face, and an eye patch over his right eye. The short one still had both eyes, which never seemed to blink, two long teardrop tattoos directly below his eyes, and he was entirely covered from head to toe. They both carried swords that they seemed to like using if the sparkle in their eyes were any indication. The wall and door were suddenly cut apart from the outside. The tall one, the more homicidal one, apparently did the cutting. Such a waste of energy came to a stray thought from Naruto. Tsunami turned, looking frightened, and cringed back from the men entering her home through the wall. The short one, the one in charge, spoke first. So, you're Tazuna's daughter, he guessed. You'll have to come with us, now. There was a crash, and Inari entered the room. Mother. No, Tsunami yells, voice full of panic, don't come out here. Run away, hurry. Don't move, the tall one yelled, then turned to his companion. Should we grab this one too? No, Gato asked for just one hostage, the short one stated. He was definitely in charge. The tall one was happy with this news, turning toward Inari, pulling his sword up, about to draw. Alright, then let's waste him. Inari felt his heart beating on his throat like a bell nonstop, his hands trembling like a leaf, his throat felt dry like a desert. Would this be his end? He found himself asking. But then he remembered the promise he had made to his father and Naruto. I won't be a coward anymore. Taking all the courage he could muster, he ran to grab a knife in the kitchen. He ran as fast as his legs could carry him. The man chased him in the kitchen. Inari turned around with his knife in his hands, holding it tightly in front of his chest, his eyes showing fear and courage. His hands were shaking slightly. Inari saw the man grinning in front of him with an evil smug on his face, his tongue licking his lips. Once I'm done with you, I will have a perfect time with your mother, he said, his right hand touching around his thighs. Inari felt a cold shiver through his body. No, no. Inari screamed in his head before rushing towards the thug aimlessly, his knife forward, ready to pierce his chest. The thug just smiled and made himself ready to slice him in two. Then he suddenly felt a bitingly cold gust of wind rush past his body at about the height of his neck. In his field of vision, he saw the back of an adolescent boy in a long coat. In his right hand was an okatana held in the follow-through position as if he had just cut something. Giving a flick of his wrist, the boy flung the tall one's blood off, then deliberately, in slow motion began returning the blade to its sheath. When he reached the homing position, the boy clicked the blade home, and the tall one's vision went dark. The short one was stunned at the speed of the attack because it occurred within the blink of an eye. One blink and Tazuna's daughter was cowed on the floor, the second blink and the okatana appeared in her hand, the third blink, she is gone from her position. The short one hears the click and turns just in time to see his partner's head roll forward off his neck. Shorty looks around, but the little boy is nowhere to be seen, as if he was never there, to begin with. But that can't be true, right? Thank Kami-sama, I'm only going to have to do it once, the boy said, turning to Short Stack. The whole time he is speaking, the boy is walking over to Short Round, who is so terrified he does not even have the presence of mind to run, as he looks at the boy's ice blue eyes looking down at him as he was a mere insect that held no value whatsoever. The body of the short one fell over dead, with a massive gash across his chest, almost splitting him into two pieces. His blood leaked around the floor like rain. Naruto looked down at him in disgust and spit at his corpse. Naruto's serious face changed to a softer one as he turned to look at Tsunami and Inari. Thankfully, I was right on time, he said smiling. Naruto made 10 clones of his own and said, clean this mess up, please. He gestured to the corpses. Suddenly he felt arms around him, and he looked down at Inari, hugging him for dear life, crying his eyes out, holding his clothes tightly, almost afraid that Naruto would disappear if he left him. You're all right now, Irani, he said, smiling and rubbing his hair. Tsunami looked relieved of what had happened and was trying to hold back tears. Don't worry, Inari, they won't hurt you, Naruto said gently, and Inari slowly moved his hands away and started wiping tears away from his face with his hand. Naruto turned to look at Tsunami. I have to go now, and my clones will stay here for protection. Tsunami just nodded her head, and Naruto grabbed a kunai from his bag and kneeled at Inari's level and reached out for him to grab it. Take it and protect your mother, Naruto said, and Inari glanced at the kunai, and his eyes turned to look at Naruto again. His face turned serious, and he nodded his head before grabbing the kunai. Naruto smiled and left to reach the bridge. Sasuke jumped back and looked around to see where the masked ninja was. The fog was too thick, and he could hardly see beyond 1 meter in front of him. His eyes looked around and hoping that Kakashi-sensei wasn't having a hard time against Zabuza. He remembered the talk he had with his sensei 3 days ago, and hoped his sensei would live to keep his promise. Eventually, the day turned to night, and Kakashi found himself looking up and staring at the multitude of bright and shiny stars on Tazuna's porch. Kakashi loved looking at the stars. He found it even more spiritually enlightening than meditation. It was some time after dinner that Sasuke also entered the porch and approached Kakashi. Always one for charity, Kakashi started the conversation. Wonderful night out, isn't it? Yeah, Sasuke said hesitantly. He was trying to find the right words for the question but wasn't doing so well. He wasn't looking at the stars, he had something else on his mind. Would you? I mean, can you tell me how you got your? I have the right to know. I mean, can't you tell me how I got my Sharingan? Sasuke nodded, slightly embarrassed at his own nervousness. He was an Uchiha, damn it. He shouldn't get embarrassed. Still, Kakashi ignored his vulnerable look and focused on the question. It's a long and complicated story that I haven't told many people except Naruto and a few others, but if anyone has a right to know, you do. Do you mind a long story? Sasuke considered for a minute before shaking his head. I want to understand. Kakashi nodded and did one of his eye smiles. My lessons on empathy are finally catching on. Well, where to start? I guess I'll explain my team first. Sasuke nodded for him to continue and prepared to imagine himself in Kakashi's shoes. My sensei, at the time, was none other than the fourth Hokage. I hope I don't have to tell you how much I looked up to him. When he fought, his speed was untraceable, even after I got the Sharingan. He had several jutsu that allowed him instant teleportation. One touch from his technique meant death. He was that kind of guy. My goal was to be a true ninja, and for me, Sensei embodied that. A giant fox was really just his worst possible opponent. The girl on my team was called Rin, and she'd been training to be a medical ninja. Originally, I didn't appreciate her enough. Because she was a medical ninja, she was pretty useless in a fight and got captured by enemies more than once. The first time, our sensei managed to save her. The second time. Despite her seriousness in medic ninja training, she was a fangirl most of the time, and I ignored her like you ignore Sakura. I never felt I had time to respond to her confessions. I figured that romance came after my goal. The third teammate was named Obito Uchiha, and he acted like a black-haired Naruto. He'd never known his parents and was bullied by all of his cousins for being the dead last in our genin class. I always beat him in spars, so I never thought of him as my equal. He hoped he'd get an edge on me once he unlocked his Sharingan, but despite all of his efforts, he couldn't get even a single Tomo in our first 2 years as a team. I should mention that he had a crush on Rin. At the time, we were in the middle of the war, and people got promoted quickly, often lacking the skills for the job. That desperation took almost as many lives as the war itself, but it was needed to keep the village afloat. It was my second year on my team when I became Jonin, primarily for my tracking skills, though my combat was still lacking. Due to a lack of human resources, we were sent on a critical mission while our sensei joined the front lines. Around halfway into the mission, we encountered some patrolling stone ninja. 3 Chunin, I believe, though they may have been stronger. We clashed a bit in the greenery, but they gained the upper hand and captured Rin, taking off with her. I wanted to follow the rules and continue on the mission since it could have ended the war, but Obito went off to save Rin instead. Why didn't you help rescue Rin? Sasuke suddenly glared. Aren't those who abandon their teammates trash? They are. Now I know. I told you this, 'cause I don't want you to use my method of realization. Kakashi responded sadly. Anyway, after thinking about it for a while, I did go back and rescue Obito and Rin. I managed a surprise attack on one of the Chunin who was about to kill Obito, but that hadn't been enough to assure victory. The second, Chunin knew a very effective hiding in the camouflage jutsu, and he stabbed my eye out before I knew what was happening. We couldn't track his movements until Obito finally unlocked his Sharingan. We ran into the cave where Rin was being held hostage and defeated the third Chunin through teamwork, but in his dying moments, he called for reinforcements and managed to bring the cave down on top of us. I was about to get crushed by a boulder, but it was then that Kakashi finally paused, and Sasuke was let out of his trance. A single tear seemed to be dripping down from Kakashi's one visible eye, and his arms were hovering over his chest as if he wanted to hug himself. After about a second, Kakashi seemed to relax, and he managed a nice smile. I was about to get crushed by a boulder, but Obito sacrificed himself to push me out of the way. In the end, half of Obito's body was crushed by rocks. He knew he wouldn't make it and knew the stone's reinforcements were coming. He offered me his remaining Sharingan eye to replace my stabbed one, and he told me to protect Rin at all costs. With the Sharingan, I managed to hold off the reinforcements for several minutes. Just before we got overwhelmed, Rin threw one of the Hokage's flying thunder god kunai at the enemy, and Sensei teleported over to see what was wrong. He rescued us. I told this story to the council when I got back, and I was allowed to keep my new eye. The main reason I wanted to be your sensei was to repay my debt to Obito. Sorry for not telling you. The two sat silently under the moonlight. Do you hate me for this eye? Will you forgive me for having it? In the end, I guess it works out. I can teach you some of what I know about it. Kakashi said hesitantly. But do you hate me for it? Sasuke thought long and hard about what he'd heard. Kakashi had lived a hard life. The idea that a non-Uchiha had a Sharingan disgusted the rest. You could almost feel the sentimental value the eye held for Kakashi, and the existence of another Sharingan welder was very practical, but the whole situation rubbed some part of Sasuke the wrong way. Choosing to ignore that part for the more practical answer, Sasuke admitted, "No. I don't think I do hate you for it. But you better show me how to use it when the time comes." Kakashi smiled in response. It felt as if a weight had been lifted off his shoulders. "I will." Sasuke saw the masked ninja rush towards him. Sasuke used his kunai in time to block her blow, but then she did something he had never seen or even heard before. She used her free left hand to do hand signs. Sasuke's eyes widened, and before he knew it, mirrors made of ice surrounded him from every direction, creating like a cage made of mirrors with no chance of escape. His eyes roamed around to see any escape. He gritted his teeth tightly and saw the reflection of the masked man in every single mirror around him. "You better surrender, you have no chance against me once I use this technique," the masked man stated as a matter of fact, like she was stating a simple truth that he should accept. Sasuke narrowed his eyes. "Surrender. Don't make me laugh," he shouted, and his eyes were looking around for any opening. The mirrors were very close to each other, leaving small gaps to run outside, but he knew the enemy wouldn't just let him run outside. Deciding to test something, he made hand signs as fast as possible. "Fire style, fireball," he shouted, and a giant fireball hit the mirror in front of him. Sasuke smiled triumphantly, thinking he had destroyed one of the ice mirrors, but to his horror, he saw the mirror look as intact as before. "Nice try," she said emotionlessly before she threw too many needles from every direction possible. Sasuke's eyes looked around and tried to dodge as many as he could. He jumped to his right. His eyes still see her reflection in every mirror. Sasuke felt his heart beating on his chest like a hammer slamming against his chest, but thankfully he felt no pain whatsoever. He smirked. "I dodged you," he said, smiling, sure that he had dodged the attack. "I wouldn't be so sure. Look at your right leg," she said, pointing towards his right leg. Sasuke looked down to see 2 needles on his right leg and a few minor skin cuts around his legs. Why had no been able to feel it? He clenched his teeth, but he felt no pain to his surprise, despite knowing his wounds. He breathed heavily, and his breath was visible in front of him, but Sasuke didn't feel the cold ground. All he could feel was his heart beating in his chest. Haku moved again and threw even more needles towards him. Sasuke moved again, but he couldn't dodge all of them. His eyes roamed around the mirrors, and he knew she couldn't be in all the mirrors at once. He knew she was moving from one mirror to another. He just needed the right moment to catch her, and it would be over. Sasuke did a hand sign, and 2 regular clones showed up in front of him. "Right, left," Sasuke shouted, and both of his clones ran towards their exit. Sasuke ran in the opposite direction as fast as he could, but Haku made quick work of the clones, showed up in front of Sasuke, and threw needles. Sasuke fell to the ground, his arms and legs bleeding from the wounds. Clenching his teeth tightly, he opened his eyes and looked at the masked ninja with courage. "I'm not going to lose." 3 regular clones showed up in front of the boy, guarding him like a shield. Haku attacked again, making all the clones disappear. She decided to move to another mirror to attack again, but before she could reach, she saw another giant fireball rush towards her direction as she was moving to another mirror. Impossible! The fireball didn't reach her, but she saw her sleeve had caught on fire. She saw Sasuke smirking towards her. She felt her anger rising before attacking again with more needles. But to her surprise, the boy in front of her dodged all of them. She moved again, trying to get behind him, but she could see his eyes not leaving her, almost like he could see her now. Haku looked at his eyes and could see his eyes had changed. A bloodline. Haku went inside the mirror behind the boy, but then she heard a shout, and her eyes turned to see him finishing his hand signs. "Fire style, shining star." The fire was much smaller, but Haku just felt this one was much more dangerous. The jutsu made contact with her mirror and exploded. Sasuke put his hands in front of his eyes to shield himself. The explosion was strong enough, and Sasuke smirked, seeing that the mirror had been destroyed. He started running towards the exit, sure he had the chance, but before he could take the step outside, Haku was suddenly in front of him with 3 needles in each of her hands. Oh no! A huge slash, and Sasuke flew in the opposite direction and hit the mirror with his back. Sasuke slowly opened his eyes, groaning in pain. A big flesh wound was across his chest, and 5 new needles had pierced his arms. Thankfully the wound in his chest wasn't deep enough. Sasuke opened his eyes and put a hand on his right knee, and tried to stand up. His body weakened, breathing heavily, his breath visible in front of his face. His chest leaked blood and slowly covered his legs, and fell in the frozen concrete. "You almost had me, but you're not the only one who can use clones," the masked man stated in front of him inside the mirror he had destroyed. Sasuke could now see the ninja, but that wasn't enough to beat her. The masked ninja moved her right hand again, but Sasuke felt no pain. Sasuke felt his knees almost falling. He could hardly keep himself standing, his vision felt fuzzy. He wanted to keep fighting, and now he could feel just how tired he was. "I can't die like this." Sasuke felt his hands shaking like a leaf, his heart beating slower. His eyes looked in the corner of his eyes and saw 2 needles sticking in the side of his neck. Sasuke didn't have time to understand what was happening to him. His eyes started closing and started falling to the ground, with only one thought on his head. Ka-chan, Tu-chan. Itachi. Chapter 39, The Battle of the Bridge. Sasuke's body almost touched the ground, but before he could fall, his body suddenly disappeared. Haku's eyes widened behind her mask, and her eyes started searching around the cage of ice. She couldn't see him anywhere, but before she could do anything, her senses screamed at her to move away. She immediately moved away from the mirror just in time to see a fist shattering it into thousands of pieces. Haku's eyes saw Naruto standing where the mirror was a second ago. His eyes were emotionless, looking at her like a hunter, and right now, she was the prey. His gaze made her feel small, almost tiny compared to the shadow of his body completely covering her. She felt trapped, her heart beating on her throat. Her left hand trembling, she quickly grabbed her left wrist with her right hand to stop it from moving. Haku didn't know why she was shaking. Was the cold? No, the cold never bothered me before. Naruto took a step closer, and Haku felt the bridge shake from his foot, almost like a giant's foot. Her body moved backwards on its own. Without thinking, she had been scared before, many times, but not even Zabuza-sama could make her feel cold. Her skin felt like it was cracking, sending shivers of fear and cold in her spine. Haku's eyes met Naruto's, and his eyes were red like blood, but a dark red. She could have sworn she saw a giant fox standing behind Naruto glaring at her, his eyes almost as large as her. Naruto saw Haku covered in fear, and he didn't need to see her face to know that she was terrified of him. He checked on Sasuke and was glad that the emo was just in a near-death state like Haku had done to Zabuza in the field. From what he could feel, he knew Zabuza had decided to fight. Despite Gato being a bitch, he still made a deal with the man to kill Tazuna. Naruto could somehow respect it. He was willing to finish the job, but Naruto could feel the many mercenaries walking towards the bridge. But Naruto could tell they were just useless swordsmen, their strength perhaps even lower than that of a genin. Naruto decided to deal with this. Having Zabuza and Haku on his side was better than dead. Haku. I will tell you this once. Surrender, Naruto stated, his eyes seizing her, his eyes narrowed and leaking a small amount of Ki. His chakra started cracking the concrete beneath his feet like glass. Something that Haku immediately noticed. Taking a deep breath, she stood higher in her legs and looked directly at Naruto. I appreciate your concern, Naruto, but I'm nothing but a weapon for Zabuza-sama and as one. I must fulfill my master's wishes. After all, no one likes a rusted weapon. Haku started with a cold tone. Naruto clenched his teeth at the word of weapon. He hated that. Many people in Hidden Leaf Village saw him as one or just a demon. No one was a weapon of anyone. Do you hear yourself? Why would you want to do this? You're not anybody's weapon, Naruto shouted. His chakra slowly started freezing the air around them. Haku looked perplexed. The ice was getting colder, the air itself felt colder, a slight barely visible cold fog started filling the air around them. The cold spread around, the concrete around Naruto's feet started cracking and freezing. I'm sorry, Naruto, but I must fight you, Haku stated with clear regret in her voice. She slowly raised her hands in front of her chest, 3 needles in both of her hands. Naruto closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. He opened his eyes again and made a hand sign. Haku's eyes focused on him, expecting something to happen, but nothing happened, as far as she could tell. Naruto knew Zabuza was losing against Kakashi-sensei. He needed to finish this quickly. If you don't want to listen, then, he disappeared mid-sentence and showed up in front of Haku. She barely had time to understand what happened when Naruto hit her in the stomach, spreading pain in her whole body. Haku hit the mirror and immediately stood up and went inside a mirror to have her advantage. Naruto didn't try to stop her from attacking. The redhead saw her reflection in every mirror around him. He had to give credit to her jutsu, it was pretty helpful, but the downside is that it took a lot of chakras. Naruto could feel Haku's chakra was already below low chunin. She had probably only a minute or less before she couldn't use this jutsu anymore. Haku prepared and threw at least 21 needles towards Naruto, but she looked shocked when the needles stopped mid-air, blocked by a shield created around Naruto. The shield looked made of chakra. Naruto was hardly visible anymore because of the shield around him. The needles slowly started falling in the ground one by one. Naruto's eyes turned to her and disappeared from the view. Haku then hit the concrete, her back hurting like crazy. She couldn't understand what had just happened. Her eyes slowly saw the figure of Naruto standing in front of her. He finished his hand signs and shouted, "Wind style, air breaker," he cried, and suddenly a huge wind spread in every direction. The wind, strong, destroyed all the mirrors around him. Haku flew away and hit the other side of the bridge, her back and shoulder bleeding from the jutsu and his fist. Haku felt her knees weak, her breathing heavy. She tried to catch her breath, to keep fighting, when she saw Naruto slowly walking towards her. When she heard a crack, her mask slowly started falling from her face. Her lower mask first fell, followed by a huge chunk covering her right eye. "Zabuza-sama. I can't defeat this boy. I'm sorry." Her mask fell in the concrete, showing her face with tears in her eyes, unshed tears. Her mind thinking of all the time she spends with Zabuza-sama. She wanted to die thinking of the good times of her life. Zabuza finding her, him covering her with a blanket when he thought that she was still asleep. But after all, a thing isn't beautiful because it lasts. She closed her eyes waiting for the killing blow. Why? You're not a weapon, how can you not see it? Not even Zabuza sees you as a weapon, Naruto said. Haku opened her eyes to see him standing, looking at her with sorrow and a hint of anger behind his blue eyes. Not red anymore, or ice, but blue like the ocean. I'm not useful to Zabuza anymore. I told you. I live only to serve him, she responded, always hoping that Zabuza would see her more than just that. Not a weapon, but maybe a daughter. Naruto shook his head in denial, not believing what Haku said. Why do you think you own it to him? Naruto asked softly with a kinder tone. He saved me, Naruto. I was alone. My family, my mother, was like me when Mizukage started slaughtering anyone with a bloodline. My father supported him when he found out that I had my mother's bloodline. He killed my mother and tried to kill me. I had no choice, she said, tears rolling down her right cheek. Naruto listened to her and understood her situation. He was interrupted when they both heard a sound coming from further away in the bridge. Naruto recognized Kakashi-sensei's jutsu. Haku's eyes widened when he saw the Jonin ready to kill her father. She quickly gathered all her energy and was prepared to save Zabuza-sama, one last time. Kakashi. When his nindogs caught Zabuza, Kakashi finally let his muscles untense, and his heartbeat returned to normal. All things accounted for, Zabuza was indeed a powerful shinobi. Though it could hardly substitute for Gai's, Zabuza's taijutsu and physical techniques were through the roof. Zabuza was keeping even Kakashi on the defensive for almost their entire match, only losing his edge when Kakashi felt Kyuubi chakra. Even Zabuza had stopped fighting and looked concerned, keeping his eyes where the chakra came from. They continued fighting immediately, and Zabuza looked to be in a hurry. Not only that, but Zabuza's water vortex jutsu, copied, was on such a large scale that it could dwarf even his water dragons. At times, Kakashi would dodge the technique yet still have trouble water walking on the resulting tsunami-like waves that the technique would stir up. Their fight was on such a large scale that it must have been causing a natural disaster in the wave. With this level of firepower being so casually thrown around, it was a wonder that the unfinished bridge remained relatively unscathed. Tazuna wasn't kidding about his renown in the bridge-building business. Early in the fight, Kakashi had lured Zabuza into the water in a ploy to spare the bridge. Due to the obvious elemental advantages he'd have in the ocean. Sadly, that had led to a long-winded clashing of water jutsu, which left Kakashi almost completely out of chakra. Kakashi may have been fast before, but with one of the chakra gates active, he managed to push Zabuza back onto the bridge. In the end, Kakashi used a scroll to start the summoning, earth release, tracking Fong technique and activated a sound-based genjutsu through whistling, buying his nindogs enough time to close in on Zabuza's location. Despite the genjutsu interference, Zabuza forced several of the initial nindogs to dispel before a lucky one got a bite on his leg and channeled the chakra paralyzation technique through the missing nin's shin, giving openings for several other nindogs to grip Zabuza with their powerful jaws and reinforce the technique. As Kakashi quickly cleared away the fog around him with his dispelling wind technique, Zabuza was revealed, standing in a very uncomfortable position with 8 nindogs dangling off him as they maintained their paralyzation jutsu. The anger on Zabuza's face contrasted hilariously with the cute nindogs hanging off of him. You know, my plan wouldn't have worked so well if you hadn't shut your eyes in the mist. Kakashi said idly, as Zabuza tried, unsuccessfully, to shake the nindogs off of his various limbs. My nindogs here are specifically designed for tracking, made to sense a faint scent from several miles away. Remember that time I let you cut me? That was to make sure you had the scent of my blood on your weapons, so I was just following your plan all along. Zabuza said in anger and self-loathing. You had everything under control since the beginning? Of course not, Kakashi responded. If I had everything under control, I wouldn't have let Haku slip by me. I would have evacuated my genin miles from here with a shadow clone or finished this fight quicker. Because of my lack of control, my students might have died. The fog is lifting, Kakashi said poetically. I can see it now, your future is death. With his Sharingan covered, Kakashi did the 9-hand signs for his original jutsu, the Chidori. He could do the jutsu without the hand signs, but he preferred his authentic way in a controlled environment, partly to save chakra and partly for sentimentality's sake. The lightning flashed between Kakashi's fingers rather impressively, but Zabuza just scoffed. What? I don't at least deserve a Raikiri? Zabuza joked. Kakashi decided to ignore him. Zabuza, you've had your fun. You've schemed your schemes. The day you deserted the Hidden Mist and became missing ninja, your name was reported to the Hidden Leaf. I know how you tried to assassinate the Misukichi. You've been on the run, trying to raise funds for a second attempt for the better part of 4 years, always narrowly evading Hunter Ninja. That's what brought you here. That's why you'd stoop so low as to work for a parasite like Gato. You're a loose cannon, a threat to this country. Willing to sacrifice this place just for your ambitions. Killing with no mercy. Spare me the philosophy lesson. Zabuza interrupted, I'm fighting for my ideals, and I won't stop. Kakashi sighed disappointedly as he raised his Chidori-encased hand. Then your future is death, Kakashi said simply, rushing forward. Zabuza's eyes closed, thinking of Haku, hoping she was alive, hoping that Kakashi wouldn't kill her. He was hoping that she had escaped somehow. Haku. I am sorry. To-san. Kakashi didn't see and didn't have time when he saw a hand catch his wrist, not letting him advance. Kakashi's eyes widened seeing Naruto stopping him from killing Zabuza. The Jonin certainly wasn't surprised that Naruto could stop his jutsu, and not to mention his chakra and strength was low. Naruto, what are you doing? Kakashi demanded with a firm tone and loud. Zabuza narrowed his eyes at the Uzumaki brat. This was the second time he had done something similar. First time letting him go, not taking him seriously. Second time saving him, of course, he was glad, but still. They're not our enemies anymore, Naruto stated with a stern tone that reminded Kakashi so much of Kushina. The dogs around Zabuza disappeared from Naruto, throwing a kunai in the summoning scroll. Before Kakashi could ask him to elaborate further, they heard clapping coming from the end of the bridge. Yeah. He's certainly made a fine mess out of you. What a pity. A smug voice said from the other side of the bridge. The 3 remaining conscious shinobi all turned their heads to look at the newcomer. At the end of the bridge stood a very smug-looking Gato in front of a small army of brigands. They were all carrying a large assortment of weapons such as swords, staves, tridents, clubs, and even had someone with a scythe. Gato was smirking and strutting around as he'd already won. It would certainly look like he had to be the casual observer. Kakashi cursed his arrogance. Why had he thought that this would just stay between shinobi? Naruto looked at the army with an icy stare. Gato, what are you doing here? Zabuza asked. What with the goon squad? Gato laughed for a second at the annoyingly slow speed civilians were forced to use. There's been a small change of plans, Zabuza. Or a change in your plans anyway. I was going to do this from the beginning. You're going to die, demon, here and now. I was never going to pay you at all. I hate paying people. Especially if they're as expensive as shinobi, your price may have been a little more acceptable, but it's still way more than I'm willing to pay. That's why I hired all these thugs. Wait till the ninja are done fighting and finish them off while they're weak. That's a good business strategy. Since you are a missing ninja, no one will complain when you're gone. And look! It worked out even better than I hoped. You're so weak and pathetic right now. I could kill you myself. And look at your opponent. A tired freak and a child. Kakashi was currently breathing heavily in exhaustion. He hadn't expected the fight to last this long. He'd expected to be finished much sooner. In truth, he hardly had enough chakra to stand. His body wanted to die in a hole, like usual, after going to the first gate. He was having trouble maintaining composure at the end of his fight with Zabuza. My only mistake was hiring you in the first place. Calling yourself the demon of the hidden mist is just plain false advertisement. Gato continued, laughing. You're no demon. You are no more than a little imp. Zabuza, who had looked down until that point, snapped his head straight up. A look of pure hatred crossed his features. Haku moved closer to Zabuza, ready to fight. Forgive me, Kakashi, our fight is over. I no longer have any reason to assassinate Tazuna, which settles our differences. Gato's eyes then saw Haku standing close to Zabuza. A creepy smile spread across his face. A smile that no one liked. My man. I want to kill everyone except the girls, each of you can have a turn with her, he said, laughing. Zabuza suddenly stood despite the pain, put his hands on Haku's shoulder, and put her behind him. Gato, you little double-crossing bastard, Zabuza spat, I didn't think you'd have the balls to betray me, but it's your funeral. You will die screaming. Before anything could happen, the whole area was engulfed in Ki, and everyone froze at the amount of Ki spread around. Zabuza wondered who could have so much Ki. His eyes slightly turned to look at the Uzumaki brat. His face was covered in a shadow. But his eyes were red like blood. Naruto walked forward. There were many things he didn't like, but the rotten monsters like them were the worst kind. Even Kurama was furious. They had stepped out of line, and now they shall know pain. Suddenly two clones showed up close to Naruto, one to his right and another to his left. All three of them did hand signs that not even Kakashi recognized. The clones finished. Uzumaki style, barrier blood. Suddenly a giant red barrier showed up. Around the bridge, it closed every direction except the direction towards Naruto and the others. The Jinchuriki finished his hand signs. Wood style, deep forest emergency. Suddenly the bridge started shaking like an earthquake. Suddenly large trees started growing around Naruto, and they all started rushing towards the army, and what happened next was something everyone would remember. The following second, screams echoed around the bridge, the trees pierced their flesh and bones snapping, the wood came out the mouth of one and split his jaw, the blood rushing out of his mouth and skin, and slowly his face split into three pieces hanging in the tree like decorations. Someone screamed until his head was smashed from the strength around his head until it exploded like a bomb. Some tried to run and jump from the bridge, but the barrier burned anyone who touched it. The wood pierced the stomach of one and came out through his eyes as blood fell in the floor like rain. One was pierced in the lungs and tree grew inside until his whole body was torn apart from the tree. Gato tried to run towards Naruto when his legs were tightened, and trees pierced him from every direction. The large tree raised high as their bodies were smashed and split into pieces. Some were hanging around the tree. The blood, skin, and flesh fall to the ground. The others kept quiet at what they saw. Kakashi knew the thugs deserved to die, but he didn't expect this. Kakashi had seen war, and a dead body was something he was familiar with. Naruto's eyes were as cold as winter. He did another hand sign and spat fire from his mouth, and the tree started burning. Zabuza had no problems and no objections with what Naruto did. In his mind, the idiots deserved worse than that, but at the same time, he was shaken beyond belief, but for a different reason. He can use wood style. Zabuza turned around and saw Haku standing behind him, looking at Naruto with a hint of caring and something else that Zabuza didn't recognize. He smiled, seeing her. I'm happy to see you all right. Haku, he said, smiling and tears slowly forming in his eyes, but he tried to keep them there. But the next thing caught him by surprise. Haku hugged him, her head in his chest, crying. I thought I lost you, Too-san, she said, crying and hugging him, almost afraid that he would disappear. He put his hand on her head and rubbed her hair. I will never leave you, my daughter, he stated and hugged her back. Haku felt her shoulders getting wet from his tears but decided to enjoy the moment. Naruto and Kakashi smiled at the touching moment. Kakashi turned to look at Naruto. I didn't know you could use wood style, he stated with crossed arms, demanding an explanation from his little brother. Only Hokage-sama, Tsunade-bachan, and Tojiji know about it, Naruto stated. Kakashi nodded in understanding and decided to talk later with him. Naruto ran back over to Sasuke and Sakura, checking to see if they were okay. Sakura was in a stable condition, thankfully. Sasuke had the faintest of heartbeats, but it seemed as if he'd recovered slightly from earlier. Either Haku hadn't aimed to kill, or Sasuke, with his Sharingan, had been able to move enough in time to avoid death. Naruto was relieved beyond belief. Even with all the training, his teammates still almost got killed. He removed the Senbon scattered around his body and shunshin him back to Tsunami's house, making sure to heal him. He then came back and checked on Haku as Zabuza and Kakashi just stood watching. She was in bad shape, but she seemed as if she was going to make it. "Why did you spare me? Why didn't you take my life after what you saw me do to your friend?" she whispered from her position on the ground. The two Jounin-level ninja heard her as they walked closer. "Because your life is precious," Naruto said as he handed her over to Zabuza. At this, Kakashi smiled, and Zabuza turned to him. "Some genin you've got, looks like we didn't need to be enemies after all. Maybe next time we see each other, we'll be allies." With that, Zabuza Momoichi, the demon of the hidden mist, bowed his head respectfully to Naruto. "Thank you Uzumaki Naruto." 2 days later. Naruto stood in front of the house, the moon high in the sky. Tazuna had returned to work and said that the bridge would be rebuilt within 4 days. Kakashi-sensei had stated that they would stay until the bridge was built. No one had anything against it and didn't say anything. Kakashi had asked Naruto that night about what he had done to the army of Gato. His sensei had asked if he was alright and needed anything, but the redhead said he was fine. Kakashi had looked specifically but had not spoken a word against what Naruto said. Surprisingly, Zabuza and Haku were standing with them until they decided to leave the wave. Right now, Naruto stood ready to reach Uzumaki. He had left a wood clone behind to stay and distract everyone until he returned. "Are you ready, Naruto?" "Remember that Uzumaki is not exactly close," Kurama asked, knowing that Uzumaki wasn't exactly close to going there by running across the sea. "I have checked, Kurama, but there's no ship that goes to Uzumaki anymore, and I don't know how to use one," Naruto stated. Kurama kept quiet and decided to be ready if Naruto needed anything later. The redhead glanced at the house behind him, taking a deep breath of fresh air. He ran towards the sea to reach his homeland. Uzumaki. Chapter 40, A Song for the Lost. Naruto. The moon shines the sea, the surface of the water, dancing close to the land, small waves hitting the shore. Despite being night, Naruto could see everything around him. His legs were shaking, his knee felt weak and numb, he felt tired, but most importantly, he reached Uzumaki. Naruto saw little grabs, running away from him, using the sand around to cover themselves until one couldn't notice that a small animal was hiding there. The scent of the sea was strong all around him, and it smelled like salt. And a little like eggs? Naruto didn't know why that smell was around him, but he didn't bother with it. The wind flew around and hit his face, his long red hair dancing with the wind. The moon makes it shine and look like a ruby. A few burned houses were nearby. Naruto could tell from the dark wood left from the fire. A few had bones around the courtyard, half-rotten clothes stuck to them. Naruto knew he was on the south side of the island. The main entry to Uzumaki was through the east, an ocean opening that led the ships to the center of the village. It was called the Sea's Pass, which led ships from Uzumaki to reach the open sea. The opening stopped in the center of the village, and the village had been built around the opening, making it easier to hunt for fish, having more accessible access to the ocean's water. Naruto remembers from his dream that the Uzumaki main village was around the end of the opening. Sea's Pass stopped in the center of the island, where Roku had started building the village. The end of the Sea's Pass where ships docked and gave supplies or took supplies was called Deepwater. Naruto didn't know why but figured must be a reason for it. Deepwater was rich with different sea animals. Uzumaki had grown their food, various vegetables, fruits, and other necessary items for a simple life. Naruto had wondered if they earned money through other means, perhaps a mine with different minerals like gold or silver, or maybe just through selling supplies and accepting jobs for ninja as the other villages did. Naruto escaped his thoughts when he started walking around the shore. This town was a bit far from the main village. This place was probably used by fishermen who didn't like to live in the village. The houses were still there of whoever lived here, but no one was alive except the animals and plants. Naruto felt the seawater wetting his black shinobi sandals. Taking a deep breath, he felt dread. He couldn't stop this feeling inside him, the place felt like calling him, but at the same, he didn't feel prepared to see his homeland destroyed. To see everything Roku had built destroyed, the place where his mother had been raised, burned to ash, and be forgotten. Naruto, I'm here with you, you're not alone, Kurama suddenly said, feeling the dread and even a hint of guilt and anger in his body. Naruto managed a small smile and mentally thanked Kurama for being there for him. The young Uzumaki half hoped that Roku would be here along with him. Closing his hands to a fist, he took a deep breath, feeling the fresh air in his lungs. The smell of mint and eggs was strong, and he wondered where the smell came from. Deciding to ignore it, he jumped through the beach, running as fast as he could. Soon he reached a forest. Naruto kept jumping from tree to tree. He noticed different animals looking at him, perhaps surprised, but he didn't stop to see them closely. He kept jumping, and the feeling was getting stronger with every step he took. His seal started glowing red and spread from his stomach around his chest and slowly spreading through his right arm. Naruto stopped moving and saw red lines slowly reaching the seal Roku had put in his wrist. The seal looked like the spread wings of a bird. The seal reached the part that separated the two wings and looked together in a small spot. Naruto didn't feel anything at first, but then he suddenly felt his chakra growing in that spot, almost like all the chakra of his body was accumulated in a single location. Suddenly, the pressure stopped, leaving a small empty red circle in it. The ring connected the two separated wings. Naruto touched the skin around his wrist but couldn't feel anything different. Not even Kurama could detect anything, and that concerned him, that Kushina or Minato or both had made a seal that kept him inside Naruto. Still, at the same time, he couldn't detect anything that the seal did to him. The lines that had spread from his seal slowly detached from the empty circle and returned to the seal. The seal stopped glowing red and turned back to its usual dark color before disappearing. Naruto. I don't feel the seal doing anything bad to you, but I know your parents would never make a seal that would hurt you, Kurama said, reassuring Naruto that the seal wasn't doing anything to harm him. The redhead knew his parents would never harm him, but he didn't know what the seal did, which annoyed him. Focusing his eyes, he spread his chakra almost like he was about to do a jutsu, but the new symbol didn't react to his chakra. Understanding that nothing happened, he stopped trying and decided to keep going. His eyes slowly looked from his seal and in front of him. There should be answers in Uzushiogakure. Naruto thought and jumped away through the forest. After almost an hour, Naruto knew he was close. Jumping from the final tree, he saw something he wasn't prepared for. In front of him stood Uzushiogakure. The walls still stood tall and strong. However, some parts of it were destroyed, the concrete still lying on the ground. His eyes saw a flag half-burned standing at the top of the wall. Naruto couldn't see the symbol, but he could tell the emblem, the Uzumaki clan. Strong wind hit his face, sending shivers in his body. He saw the wall stretched from south to the north. The wall looked 2 times larger and taller than the wall of Konoha. The wall had small plants growing around it, creating small cracks, slowly destroying what was left. Naruto noticed a few houses standing close to the gates of the village. The gates were burned. What was left was a huge chunk somehow still hanging from the top of the wall until that part fell as well. Despite being years since anyone was here, Naruto felt the scent of fire all around the place, almost like the place was still burning to this day. Naruto felt sadness covering his body like a cold blanket, and his fist closed, his knuckles turned white like milk. He bit his lower lip tightly, his eyes full of tears, his vision fuzzy. Naruto quickly used his left sleeve to wipe the tears away. He was here to find answers and learn. Naruto. I know this might not be the best time, but you should know that even I respect your clan. I hated everyone else, but your clan was different, and so are you, Kurama said, feeling the sadness of Naruto. The young Uzumaki stood silent for a few minutes before smiling and nodding his head. Thank you, Kurama, Naruto said, and the fox smiled. The young Uzumaki started walking towards the gates, what was left of them. His eyes looking at the houses as he passed by, the houses surprisingly didn't look destroyed, but just abandoned. He wondered why. His blue eyes soon noticed something. None of the houses close to the wall looked damaged, and the same was for the ground around the gates. He half expected small craters and maybe even clothes and what was left, but he couldn't see anything to implement that a fight was fought outside of the gates. His eyes turned to the gate itself. The gate looked 10 meters tall, but he noticed no seals around the wall. Either the seals had stopped working or were very well hidden. His eyes saw inside the gates and could tell inside looked much different. The destroyed houses were everywhere. He couldn't see anything that wasn't wasted. Taking the first step inside, neither Naruto nor Kurama detected the seal of life letting him inside the village. His seal glowed red for a moment before disappearing again. Walking inside, he felt alone. Cold. Sad. Angry and guilty. Everything was covered in darkness. Each house inside the village looked destroyed, nothing left but rubble. The signs of a war fought here were everywhere, from the ruins in the ground, small craters around the earth, houses burned, their concrete looked to have melted in some places, making look slippery. Weapons lying around the ground, trees that looked clearly to have been cut down. Naruto's eyes went to the center of the village that had the most magnificent building. Still standing, the building looked white. The roof looked similar to that of Konoha, except the Uzumaki symbol was in the center. The streets looked covered by white bricks. He saw a few parts of the roads had started splattering from the plants growing around. The redhead knew what he would see when he arrived here, but still the feeling of complete silence, no sound could be heard around, setting a sense of dread around, almost like something was hidden in the shadows waiting to come out. Naruto slowly walked inside a house. His footsteps were the only sound around. He slowly opened the front door made of strange wood that had weird marks around. The door made a brassy sound. Inside he saw a thick level of dirt covering everything. Everything looked gray. Naruto saw a hole in the roof, and below the hole was what looked like bones and clothes still covering it. Naruto saw arrows that had pierced the wall from inside. A few weapons were lying in the ground close to another body. Weapons like a small sword, kunai, and a few shurikens. Naruto, you don't need to see this, Kurama said, knowing that Naruto felt guilty about what he was seeing, despite not being his fault. Naruto closed his eyes, the silence almost swallowing him whole. He felt cold shivers around his body, his skin felt like something was crawling. Naruto didn't say anything but just left the house, not wanting to stay there any longer. Walking through the streets, he found bones lying around, some shattered and some missing hugs chunks. He saw a few small bones in a dress covering them. After a few minutes of walking, he soon reached the docks of Uzumaki. As usual, everything was deserted. There were a few small ships still docked, but none of them was in condition to use. They were either filled with water or almost destroyed. Naruto saw empty crates lying around close to where the ships were docked. His blue eyes turned to look at the main building of the village that stood the closest to deep water. Do you think there's anything that might help me for Fuinjutsu? Naruto asked out loud, since there was no need to talk mentally. No one would hear him here. I'm not sure, Naruto, but even if there's something, don't expect for the doors to just open for you, and be careful. The seal might have left you to walk inside, but you can never be too careful, Kurama warned him. Despite he not thinking that there was anything too worthy about, would be good to keep an eye out for anything unexpected. Naruto nodded his head in agreement. He soon made his way to the main building of Uzumaki. While walking there, he saw the fountain was still there, the statues of children playing were still there, water was still coming out of their hands and falling in the basin. One of the statues had his head destroyed, but still, he could tell how it looked before. One of the hands was in the mud, but one of the children's status was intact. Naruto walked closer, put his hands together, filled his hands with water, and splashed it in his face. The water was cold but still fresh and not filled with dirt or blood. He turned around and looked at the gates that lead inside the main building, one of the gates still standing. The wind flew everywhere, hitting his face, making the gates slowly move around and making small and terrible sounds, almost like someone using his nails in a blackboard. Naruto walked inside the house, seeing that it was intact. Before him was a long, wide-open corridor with closed doors on both sides, but what surprised Naruto was that nothing looked damaged. The walls and everything looked unclean, but still no sign of battle inside the building. He soon reached a large door that led inside a big hall. The hall had many windows that let the light of the moon stream inside. Naruto saw a desk at the very end of the hall. Walking up to it, he saw papers lying around the desk and on the ground covered in dust. Naruto used his hand to shake off the dust. The papers were nothing but filled with missions completed around the island of Uzumaki, and around Wave, and even some missions completed in Kiri. Naruto noticed one of the names in the papers was mentioned far often than the others. Apparently this Kurayama Uzumaki had completed over 100 missions in a single month, but the documents mentioned nothing else. Naruto didn't think of it as necessary despite being impressed by the number of missions he had completed. Naruto, do you feel this? Kurama asked. Naruto closed his eyes, and now he actually felt something in this hall. He turned around and looked beneath him. Strange symbols were covering the floor. But Naruto could tell this was a seal. An advanced one. He did hand signs. Open, he said, and the seal started glowing red. Before the ground began shaking, almost like an earthquake. The floor in the middle of the hall began opening. Naruto walked closer and saw stairs leading under the building. But he could hardly see anything. "Let me help you." Naruto's eyes changed to red, and now he could see more clearly in the darkness. He walked downstairs, his eyes roaming around and wondering where this was leading to. Soon he reached a door. Opening it, he saw a large room filled with scrolls and books, almost like a library. Suddenly, fires lighted around the walls, torches started burning again, and he could see the most extensive library he had ever seen in front of him. The shelves filled with scrolls and books stretched at least hundreds of meters. The symbol of the Uzumaki clan was standing proudly in each scroll and book. Naruto saw many desks, tables around, and chairs. He was about to look at some of the books when something blue started appearing in front of him. It looked like a bright light. Naruto covered his eyes, and soon the light stopped. The young Uzumaki moved his hands away and in front of him was Roku Uzumaki. His whole body looked slightly transparent and bluer than in his dream. "Roku-sama! Roku-sama!" The old Uzumaki smiled proudly at the young man. He had passed the seal of life and the seal of the truth. When Roku was 241 years old, he had made the seal of truth. The seal would work to detect the color of someone's chakra. The darker a person was, the colder and gray was their chakra. The seal protected the secret library of the Uzumaki clan. If the seal had detected that Naruto wasn't worthy, then a counter seal would be activated, and Naruto's chakra system would have been blocked, resulting in immobility ever to use chakra. Naruto noticed the sama that Kurama used and was surprised to hear him say that but decided to ask later. Naruto bowed his head respectfully to Roku, who gestured for him to stand up. "No need for that, young Uzumaki. It seems you were able to find this place," Roku said, smiling. Kurama stayed silent and couldn't believe that Roku was here. He still remembered him, despite being 1,500 years since he died. Kurama stood beneath a large tree in the land of fire. He was only a bit taller than 4 meters. Kurama had decided to explore the grounds around alone. Gyuki and Nanabai had wanted to come, and especially Matatabi, since she was the friendliest to him. But Kurama had declined and instead told them he wanted to be alone for some time and possibly be friends with the humans since his father had told them. The others had accepted and left to go alone. Shikaku had mentioned that he wanted to flee towards the south soon enough. After all, he loved the sand. Kurama opened his mouth and closed it, his eyes still closed, enjoying the sound of the forest around him. "You're quite big," he heard a voice and immediately jumped awake. His eyes opened, and he looked forward to being met with the purple eyes of a human. For a moment, he thought that Tu-chan was there, but giving him a second look, his eyes were just purple but no Rinnegan. "Who's this? How come I didn't feel him coming? And second, why is he smiling? And third, why does he look so familiar?" Kurama bombarded himself with questions and noticed the strange human was still standing there smiling. "My father told me about you, but I never thought you would be so cute," the strange human said. "What? I'm not cute," Kurama yelled angrily and showed his teeth, trying to intimidate him. "Calm down. I just felt your chakra a week ago and wanted to meet you." "I'm not here to hurt you," the strange man said, raising his hands and showing that he wasn't here to hurt him. Kurama stopped releasing his ki and looked at his face. The man had long red crimson hair that reached his neck, a long face, and a trim beard around his jawline and chin but no mustache. His smile reminded him of Tu-chan, and now that Kurama could feel his chakra, he noticed the similarities between his father and this strange smiling man. "I'm not afraid of you, strange smiling person," Kurama growled. "My name is Roku, and I would like to talk to you," he stated and walked closer before sitting on the ground close to Kurama. The Nine-Tails Fox rolled his eyes. "Why is that?" Kurama growled. "Well, my father told me a lot about you, and I would like to know you better," Roku said. Kurama narrowed his eyes slightly. Who was his father that apparently knew about them? Kurama wasn't stupid. He knew that not that many people knew about them. "Who is your father?" Kurama growled slightly, showing his teeth again. Roku just laughed and didn't look scared of him. That made Kurama a bit happy, but this wasn't the time for that. "My father is Ashura Otsutsuki." Kurama's eyes widened in disbelief. He had noticed the similarities but didn't think that the brat in front of him was the grandson of his father. A smile slowly across his face, and his face brightened like a sun. "It's good to meet you, Roku," he said happily, "and perhaps this journey was for the better." Kurama remembered it, and a tear was slowly showing on his left eye. Naruto was about to say something to Roku when Kurama suddenly took control. "It's good to see you, Roku," Kurama said with Naruto's body and gave the control back to Naruto before Roku could say something to him. Roku chuckled slightly. One moment, the young Uzumaki was talking, and the next, Kurama was talking. "You haven't changed at all, Kurama," he said smiling. a smile that Kurama recognized very well. Naruto could feel the happiness of his friend and be glad for that. I hope Kurama is not giving you problems, Roku said. Naruto shook his head. Nah, he's just an overgrown furball, he said, and even Roku could hear Kurama screaming at him for calling him a furball. Usually, Roku would have laughed, but this wasn't the moment. Roku's face suddenly changed to a serious one. He looked at Naruto. The young Uzumaki felt his eyes piercing his soul. Before you can study Fuinjutsu, young Uzumaki. I need to show you something, Roku stated with a firm tone. Naruto understood the seriousness of his tone and nodded his head. You might want to rebuild Uzushiogakure, but without understanding the past and what led to the destruction of our village, we will be doomed to repeat it, he stated, and everything changed around them. Chapter 41, A Dream. Naruto and Roku stood in front of a big house near a river. The house was very well decorated, a 3-floor house made of wood. The wood had the symbol of a wolf around the edge. In front of the house was a tree with red leaves covering the ground like a red blanket, the sun shining down on the tree and the house. The river was flowing near the tree, fishes swimming across the river, sometimes jumping from the surface and falling in the water again, making splash sounds. Birds flew near the river to drink water before flying back. Few had made tiny houses in the tree. Little birds crying out for their parents to feed them was heard around the tree. A bluebird quickly landed near them with a butterfly on his beak, feeding his little bird. Naruto and Roku stood on the other side of the river, staring motionlessly at the house in front of them. The redhead smiled at the nature in front of them but wondered why he was here. His eyes turned to look at Roku-sama, who had a melancholy look on his face. Almost like knowing what the young Uzumaki wanted to say, Roku sighed and slightly turned his head at Naruto. This was the home of my parents. My father lived here. Despite being known and having great power on his hands, he didn't care to have the luxury. Like some people, Roku spat the last part with venom. My grandfather believed that spreading his knowledge of chakra would unite people, the wars would stop, and peace would finally come, he said as he remembered something he regretted, his eyes looking downwards and slowly shaking his head. What happened? Naruto asked curiously, his hands resting behind his head, a calm look on his face as he observed and had all his attention on him. My father spread the knowledge of chakra around the world, but in the beginning, not that many people were keen on using chakra. Some people even believed that chakra pulled out the worst on people, making them emotionless and arrogant. And, maybe it did to some, he said regretfully. The house door in front of them opened. Walking outside was what Naruto thought to be a young Roku Uzumaki, despite being old. Naruto could tell from his long face and sharp features that the man in front of him was Roku. He was wearing a weird cloth that covered his body, no pants or shirts. The fabric was white except the part around his chest covered in a red dark color that had strings to tighten together. He had a weird golden symbol of a whirlpool around his sleeves. Ajana, Saikatsu, come outside. Tusan said we need to go to Jiu Town by tomorrow morning. Young Roku yelled at whoever was inside. Suddenly outside stepped a woman around his age with dark hair that reached her shoes. She was wearing a white kimono. Her face was shaped like a heart with red crimson eyes. Small forehead but with a small scar around her left eyebrow. Her lips were full and full chest. Her skin looked slightly pale. A sword on her right hand, the blade short, with a silver pommel. Roku-chan, our father said we have time until tomorrow evening. A Jane who addressed Roku as her brother, said, her smile spreading on her face and a small chuckle escaping her lips when she noticed the irritation on her brother's face. Young Roku crossed his arms in front of his chest. We need to do our job, Aya, and we can't disappoint our father, Roku stated, but Naruto noticed the slight tone he used when he used her nickname. Ajana sighed. She had heard that before many times. Our father never said we are forced to do anything. Wouldn't hurt to take things more lightly, she suggested, sometimes bored of her brother taking things too seriously. He opened his mouth to object, but a shorter man came running from inside, smiling from ear to ear. OJ Roku, are you going to lecture us again, or can we be in our way? The man who Naruto guessed was Saikatsu spoke. He noticed his smile not leaving his face. The boy looked younger than Roku and Ajana, at least by around 4 years or more. He stood 1 meter and 21 centimeters tall. He was wearing white clothes like Roku. A sword tightened behind his back, and a small bag tightened around his hips. His face is smaller than Roku's, but with a small nose, his eyes green like grass. Roku sighed, bored, pinching the bridge of his nose. He opened his eyes to look at his brother. You never take things seriously. If it were up to you, we would spend our whole time sitting in the grass listening to birds singing all day long, he said, bored. Saikatsu looked offended for a split second before smiling again. What's wrong with that? I like good songs, or do you expect me to listen to your songs? He said, leaning his head closer to Roku. Ajana chuckled slightly while Roku just shook his head before turning around and walking away. No wonder you still don't have a lover, he said quietly, smirking, but he didn't notice a slight frown on Ajana's face. Roku said nothing, but they just continued forward to reach the town, hopefully, sooner rather than later. Naruto watched with amusement while Roku had a sad smile on his face. My father told us to reach the town and help them with the plague and possibly teach whoever wanted how to use chakra. The town we went was located in the land between the lands of trees, land of fire, and mountains land, Kyumo. The place was good. Almost everyone was friendly towards each other, and helping a town like that would make people see our family as good, old Roku stated before a frown showed on his face. At least that's what we thought. Before Naruto could ask what he meant, the scene changed, showing Roku walking towards the town. Naruto could see the town was surrounded by a deep forest and located near a lake. In the middle of the town were a few houses with 2 floors, but overall, every other house was with only 1 floor. It was the middle of the day, the sun high in the sky. Roku looked focused and was slightly anxious, while Ajana was checking if they had taken everything, while Saikatsu looked to be talking to a bird that was resting on his shoulder. Saikatsu, what would it take for you to focus on something at least once in your life? Roku half shouted at his little brother. The bird flew away, much to the disappointment of Saikatsu, who looked hurt. Ajana wanted to tell Roku to lay off him, but Saikatsu talked first. He turned to Roku with an angry look, but his face softened. Very well. I'm sorry, you're right, he said and walked ahead of them. Roku expected his brother to be angry while Ajana had a slight smile on her face, happy that it hadn't escalated like usual. Roku-chan, be more gentle. Saikatsu is still only 15 years old. He will be more serious, she said quietly, especially when she mentioned his name. Naruto raised an eyebrow in confusion. Roku looked at her red eyes and nodded his head in defeat. Maybe you're right, he said quietly and turned to walk towards his brother, who had gained a distance between them. Soon they reached the town. The streets were mostly empty, except a few people walking around holding big logs in their arms bringing them to their homes. Roku knew soon enough this works wouldn't be hard to do anymore. With chakra, people's work would be easier, sickness easier to heal. People would be happy amongst each other, just how Grandpa predicted. Naruto, back then despite the knowledge of chakra being known. It took a long time for that knowledge to spread around the elemental nations. That's why when I was young, many people didn't even know what chakra was, let alone how to use it, old Roku stated. Naruto nodded his head with a small hint of sadness. Chakra was supposed to unite people, to bring peace, but instead of doing that, it just made wars more dangerous. There's a bad thing for everything, Naruto. Even when you do good things, there's always will be a bad thing that comes out of it, Kurama stated, knowing what Naruto was thinking. The young Uzumaki said nothing but just nodded his head. This happened in the year 1401 BNW, before Ninja War. This town changed my view of my own people, old Roku said with a sad smile. The young siblings asked where the sick people were around the town, but nobody said anything. Most would freak out when they noticed their clothes. Roku knocked on another door and noticed many medallions hanging around the door. The door opened only halfway, revealing a man's face. His eyes looked at his eyes and started filling with fear. Roku noticed it. How cc can I help you? He asked, stuttering. His hands that were holding the door were shaking. We're not here to hurt you, we're here to help for the plague, Saikatsu suddenly asked behind Roku before moving his brother aside and having a softer face. The man eyed his brother. Please just leave us. We have already given you enough gold, the man said desperately. Roku's face turned to anger, his teeth clenched. Why did this man think they were here to get gold? He was about to object when Saikatsu raised his hand at him to keep silent before turning his head to the man. What do you mean? Who's collecting gold? Saikatsu asked, thinking that maybe the town was terrorized by groups of people. The man looked more frightened by his question, his face lost color, and his lower lip started trembling. People with wire clothes. Your S symbol. They still take our gold in exchange for healing the sick people, the man said, his voice shaking like a leaf. Roku's knuckles turned white. His people had sworn to protect and help people and never rob them. He slammed his hand on the wall, causing the man to flinch and back away. Stop lying, our people would. Roku, Ajana shouted at him before turning to the man. I'm really sorry, she apologized to him who looked frightened and was lying on the ground covering his face with his hands. She sighed and gave her brothers a look, and they left. Walking away from the house, Roku, still in a bad mood, stomped the ground in anger. Can you believe him? Our people would never harm innocent, Roku said sure and looked at his sibling for approval. Ajana looked uncertain but nodded her head on end, but Saikatsu didn't say anything in approval. Roku, I think we should look around the town and find the truth. The man might be lying or not, but you noticed how everyone in the town is frightened the moment they saw our clothes and our symbol. Something is happening here, he said, pointing towards the east part of the town. Roku shook his head in denial. Their people were trained by their father. They would never harm innocent, he thought and walked past his brother, shaking his head. Saikatsu looked down, hoping that he and the town were wrong. Ajana put a hand on his shoulder, giving him a reassuring smile trying to make him feel better. Saikatsu smiled back, and they followed their brother. They visited a few more houses, but no one said anything worthwhile. Some of them would straight up close the door in their face and tell them that to leave and stop terrorizing the town. Roku would shake his head in disbelief. After all, they were here to help those people, but none of them wanted their help, calling them thieves. Naruto and older Roku kept observing. The young Uzumaki agreed with Saikatsu. He didn't know why but couldn't shake off this odd feeling about the whole situation. Everyone in the town was sure that people with white clothes and their symbols were taking gold from the town to heal whoever was sick. What do you think about the situation, young Uzumaki? Roku asked with a neutral tone. Naruto turned to him. I think your brother might be right, he replied. Roku closed his eyes, and a small smile was on his face before it disappeared just as soon as it appeared. Let's see then, Roku said. Young Roku reached the houses near the river. He could see the river, but what caught his attention was that no ships were hunting for fish, and the water itself didn't look blue, looked a bit gray, raising a red flag. They eat and drink from this river. Perhaps something has poisoned the waters? Roku thought, and his siblings seemed to be thinking the same thing. Saikatsu walked towards the river and touched the surface, his fingers wet, and the water looked slightly gray. He turned to Roku, who was waiting for his answer. Even a blind man can see this. The water is poison, but I'm sure someone has done it on purpose, Saikatsu stated with an angry look on his face. Something new even for Roku and Ajana. I will ask around the town. You and Roku can see where the poison is coming from, Ajana suggested, and both of them nodded in agreement. They separated. Roku and Saikatsu started running across the river trying to find the source. They split to cover more ground. Ajana. She looked around the town, trying to find something. The streets looked deserted, winds flying closely, but no other source of sound anywhere. She glanced at her left, noticing a few people hiding behind corners. She saw knives and even machete in their hands, glaring at her with hatred. She could feel and see these people didn't want them here. The thought that maybe someone from their group was taking gold in exchange for safety disgusted her. They were supposed to unite people. Her grandfather had wanted that his whole life. Why couldn't people see that? Suddenly people from corners around her came out holding knives, glaring at her with hatred and some malicious feelings behind their eyes. Ajana's hand went to her sword, ready to cut them down if they tried anything. She saw one in front of her, who she believed to be in charge of these people. He had a small beard and long dark hair with a scar that went from his nose across his right cheek and ended close to his jawline, a sharp nose, and thin lips that one would think he had no lips, his face long with a pointy chin, dark eyes like night, and he looked around his 30s, good quiet build. His clothes were white and blue, torn around his chest, knee and elbow. Unlike the others, this one had his machete still behind his back and not pointing at her. What do you want? Ajana asked, wary and ready to protect herself. I want you and your people to leave. Since your people came, the plague has started. And if that wasn't enough, you're taking gold from our family, and you call yourself savers. He screamed the last part but still kept his machete behind his back. The people around him and shouted in agreement. What are you talking about? My group helps people, and we would never harm any town, she replied, trying to reason with the man in front of him. Before he could speak again, a woman walked forward from the small gathering of people around her. She was holding a little boy in her arms, her eyes glaring at her with tears rolling down her cheek, her teeth half broken. Help! Look what you people did to my boy, she shouted with venom through her teeth. A slight glance at the boy in her arms, and Ajane immediately looked the other way. The boy looked around 4 to 6 years old. But half of his face was burned, barely any skin left, only red. We didn't pay you last month, and she started sobbing, holding her child close before walking away. The man in the front gave the woman a reassuring smile and a kiss on the boy's head before she walked away. turning to Ajana. I want you gone, leave, and we won't hurt you, he said, gesturing for her to leave the town. But one guy on her right shouted at him, how can you say that, Sanagi? After what these monsters did to your son? He shouted, pointing an accusing finger at Ajana. Tanner, the man with the name Sanagi in the front, shouted at him with a warning glare. Tanner closed his mouth and kept silent, everyone else kept quiet too. Seeing no objections, Sanagi turned to the girl. Just leave us, he said, sounding tired. Ajana felt hurt, she didn't want to leave these people. No, she wanted to help, she knew Roku would probably have a way to help this town. Without saying a word, she just nodded her head and jumped away. Soon she reached the forest outside the town and raised her chakra level, wanting her brothers to come here quickly. It didn't take long, and soon Roku showed, followed by Saikatsu. She was about to say what happened, but before she could open her mouth to talk, Saikatsu says that our people did this to this town. He says they spread the plague, Roku said, gesturing at Saikatsu with a slight glare, and he glared back. Roku, perhaps he's right. These people accuse us that. No. Our father would never train people that are not worthy, Roku interrupts without giving it a second thought. Their father was all about the good in the world. Perhaps Indra could have done something, but to their information, their uncle had disappeared around Strongstone, IWA, far away from this town. And not to mention he liked to be alone, rather than have many people around him. Ajana closed her eyes for a moment, annoyed by the blind belief of her big brother that some people might have just pretended to be good people so that they could learn chakra. She was about to object when Saikatsu pulled out something from his pocket. I found this material around the river on the north side, he said, pulling out a small bag filled with red dirt. Ajana's eyes widened, recognizing tears of anise poison, one small sample, enough to kill 10 people, and the worst part where it had no smell, one could drink or eat in his food and never realize it. Even the symptoms were very similar to simple flu until your lungs are suddenly destroyed, and you die. Even Roku was surprised, someone has done this, and there's only one way to understand who did this. We will wait until the people that come here to collect gold come again, Ajana suggested. Saikatsu nodded his head in agreement immediately, Roku sighed before nodding. After 13 days. The young siblings had been waiting outside the town since they arrived. Roku had sent a letter to their father with an eagle explaining that they would be late and that this job took longer than usual. They hadn't visited the town since that day and were still waiting. Saikatsu had tried many times to go into the town to help them in any way possible, but Ajana explained that they didn't want their help and had explained what had happened after they had left. Roku had been angry when he heard that they had threatened her, but she said that it was no problem. Now she was waiting for anything to happen. Saikatsu was walking around the camp, his head down and deep in thought. Roku had closed his eyes and was trying to combine fire and lighting to create a new ninshu. Suddenly they heard screams coming from the town without a second of hesitation. Saikatsu jumped first towards the town, not thinking. Wait, Saikatsu, Roku yelled, but their little brother had already left. Soon Ajana and Roku followed, seeing smoke coming out from a few houses from the center of the town. People were lying on the ground, dead near the center of the town. She saw her brother near a few people, and she immediately recognized their clothes. A house was burning close to them, 5 people with the same clothes and symbols as them. Ajana stood near Saikatsu, who clenched his teeth in anger. Roku stood in front of them with a clear frown and disappointment on his face. Why are you doing this? My father taught you the art of chakra to help people, Roku asked calmly but ready for anything. The man in front of the group started laughing at him, slapping his knees. Do you think we care about these people? While your father's nonsense words were annoying, at least it paid off. We are above humans, and these peasants are nothing, he said, pointing at the people of the town. Roku still kept his cool, but Saikatsu pulled out his sword, ready to kill them, but Ajana held him back. I see, chakra is supposed to unite people. Not this, Roku shouted, causing the whole group to laugh. Let me tell you one little secret, this world will never be in peace. As long as greed exists, peace will never exist. This chakra you speak so fondly of will only cause more war. Mark my words, he said before the group rushed towards them. Roku sighed sadly before making a move towards the leader. In an instant, Saikatsu, Ajana, and Roku were behind them. Water slash, they shouted, and 4 of them fell to the ground, blood streaming out of their throats except for the leader, who had a massive slash across his chest but still standing. He slowly turned his body in their direction, using his sword to stand blood coming out his mouth. Go ahead. I will never beg, he said through his clenched teeth. Roku sighed sadly and walked towards him. He put his blade close to his neck and looked at his enemy with sadness. Any last words? Fight, fight and keep fighting. The day will come when you will understand me. Roku nodded, and with a single swing, his head rolled down in the ground. The scene changed. Now Naruto looked at old Roku with a sad smile. That day, I understood that chakra would not unite anyone. That day I decided to build a place where everyone can call home. Yuzushiyogakure. That's it for part 6. Thank you for watching and see you in the next video.